The Oversight and Government Reform Committee will now reconvene. We are in the midst of discussing a bill, H.R. 50, the Unfunded Mandates Information and Transparency Act. And at this time, I'm happy to recognize any member who may wish to strike the last word or offer an amendment. Are there any amendments? The ranking member has an amendment. The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman, I have an amendment.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 50 offered by Mr. Cummings of Maryland.
The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, is recognized for 5 minutes to explain his amendment. Without objection, the amendment is considered as read.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment addresses a significant flaw in the bill we are considering. The bill would require an agency to provide private sector entities with the opportunity to weigh in on proposed rules before other impacted parties. I firmly believe that businesses should have the opportunity to express their views on agency rules. I also believe that agencies should consider the potential impacts of a proposed rule on the private sector. However, corporations should not have the ability to exercise greater influence on rules than other stakeholders. This amendment will require agencies to consult with other impacted parties as well, such as veterans, law enforcement, or religious groups. These are only a few examples of the types of stakeholders who would be put at a disadvantage by the underlying legislation. The Unfunded Mandates Reform Act requires agencies to consult with state, local, and tribal governments on proposed rules that contain intergovernmental mandates. Congress chose to limit this early consultation requirement to government entities. It is fundamentally unfair to extend the requirement to only one type of non-governmental entities, private sector companies, while not giving the same advantage to other groups, especially the very people the rules are designed to protect. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the amendment. The purpose of this bill is to ensure that the federal government understands the impact of regulations on those that are most effective, and certainly small businesses are affected on a regular basis. Just expanding the consultation requirement for the impacted parties is important. If we propose a rule that has a major impact on a particular group, it just makes common sense that those regulators should consult those that are most affected. And, the gentleman's amendment, I enjoy a tremendous relationship with my law enforcement officers, veterans, and religious groups. However, this amendment misses the point. I want to point out that UMRA defines the private sector as individuals, partnerships, associations, corporations, educational and nonprofit institutions, and doesn't limit it to the state, local, or tribal governments. Those groups that the ranking member's amendment seeks to protect are already in the base text of this bill because the definition includes them. And so when you go and you look at these regulations affecting groups, it's better to make sure that those affected get a say. This amendment, if it were to pass, would create an undue focus on a different group instead of working families. I'll give you a prime example. Instead of looking at family farmers, which I've got a very strong agricultural community in my district that understands the impact of perhaps new corn regulation, this amendment would actually seek to get information from a different path of people with a different focus. So small businesses need to be included, and I would ask the ranking member to consider withdrawing his amendment because indeed the way that this is drafted would imply that our veterans and our law enforcement officers and certainly our religious groups are not included in the base text, and that's just not the case. And so I would urge all my colleagues to vote no on this amendment.
Will the gentleman yield?
Sure.
I appreciate the position you've taken on this amendment. I happen to agree with that. I think the purpose of the bill is to ensure that the federal government fully understands the impact of regulations on those most affected, and those groups that you had mentioned that should be included are included. I think the spirit in which this first legislation was passed is an important one. I just want to make sure that the proper people have an opportunity to be part of that process. And so the bill is moving in the right direction. I'm glad we're bringing this up as one of the first bills that we're doing out of this committee, but I would stand in opposition to the amendment offered by the gentleman. With that, I yield back. The gentleman from North Carolina yields back. Any other discussion on the amendment? Hearing none, are there any amendments to the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Maryland. Those in favor by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. The opinion of the chair is the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. As previously announced, are there any other further amendments? I should have mentioned that the amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments? The question is now on the adoption and favorable reporting of H.R. 50 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No. Roll call.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill, we're asking for a recorded vote. Further proceedings will be postponed, as previously noted. The next item for consideration is H.R. 313, the Wounded Warriors Federal Leave Act of 2015, authored by the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, and the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold, who is a co-sponsor. I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Hearing no objections, so ordered. I now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, for 5 minutes to explain his bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank you and also the ranking member, gentleman from Maryland, for your continued support of H.R. 313, the Wounded Warriors Federal Leave Act. Our committee first marked up this legislation in September of last year and favorably reported it to the House, the full House, by voice vote, and I'm grateful that H.R. 313 has been placed on the markup calendar for our first business meeting of the 114th Congress. I'd also like to thank the various veterans services and federal employees and managers associations that have endorsed H.R. 13, and I would ask unanimous consent if we could enter into the record letters from the VFW, the Federal Postal Commission, the National Treasury Employees Union, the American Federation of Government Employees, AFL-CIO, the Federal Managers Association, in support of this legislation.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. The heart of this matter is that when veterans with disabilities that have been determined to have over 30% disability are entering the federal workforce, the current law regarding federal employees is inadequate in addressing the needs of those veterans. Currently, a first-year federal employee will begin his or her career in the federal workforce with a sick leave balance of 0 hours. That's the problem. So we've got these folks coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan. They're determined to be, under this bill, they're determined to be at least 30% disabled, yet they have 0 hours to go out and have their issues addressed, including PTSD and all of the other ailments that might afflict them. That is because you earn 4 hours of paid sick leave for every pay period. And while a federal worker may accrue a maximum of 104 hours during the year, or 13 days of paid sick leave during the course of a year, and can carry over any annual sick leave from year to year, you still begin your first year on the job with 0 sick leave. This lack of initial leave for new federal workers is particularly burdensome for those who are also wounded warriors and must make regular visits to the VA in order to receive treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, severe physical injuries, and other service-connected disabilities. The additional difficulty faced by these brave men and women is that these regular visits to the VA are also required in order to retain their disability rating, so they're continually evaluated. And as reported by the Veterans of Foreign War, quote, this means that newly hired disabled veterans must choose between taking unpaid leave to seek care for their injuries or forego receiving that care altogether, close quote. The Federal Managers Association further notes that its members have witnessed, quote, young men and women struggling with available leave as they attempt to keep service-related medically necessary appointments, close quote, which puts stress on both managers and their federal employees trying to meet their congressional mandated missions and goals. Several wounded warriors in the federal workforce have highlighted these challenges during recent discussions with my staff. These employees reported that absent sufficient sick leave during their first year in the federal workforce, they often chose to skip their scheduled VA appointments rather than take a day off work without pay. I'd note that in some cases, the closest VA facility was located a 2 to 3 hour drive from their federal job. In order to better ensure that we afford our newly hired veterans with disabilities the flexibility and opportunity to continue their medical treatment as they transition to careers in the federal workforce, I've introduced H.R. 313, the Wounded Warriors Federal Leave Act, along with Ranking Member Cummings and Representatives Farenthold, Conley, Jones, Butterfield, and Ms. Norton as original co-sponsors. This legislation would provide first-year federal employees with VA disability rating of over 30% or greater with 104 hours of wounded warrior leave for the purpose of undergoing medical treatment for their service-related disabilities. Eligible federal employees could make use of this leave by simply submitting certification to their agency in a manner that will be prescribed by the federal government within 9 months of enactment. And moreover, my legislation recognizes that these dedicated federal employees will have accumulated up to 104 hours of traditional sick leave by the end of their first year. So accordingly, H.R. 313 also provides that any unused wounded warrior leave would not carry over beyond that first year. In light of the legislative jurisdiction of this committee over Title V of the United States Code, and H.R. 313 covers all Title V agencies, or 85% of the federal workforce, including our largest federal employer of veterans, the Department of Defense, and the United States Postal Service. Mr. Butterfield of North Carolina will be reintroducing complementary language, which I will be happy to co-sponsor, to extend the coverage for additional newly hired wounded warriors in the remaining 15% of the federal workforce. Mr. Chairman, I thank you again for your help in moving this legislation through committee. I look forward to working with you and my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to ensure that it receives prompt consideration on the House floor. I also look forward to working with Senator John Tester and Senator Jerry Moran, who recently introduced bipartisan companion legislation over in the Senate, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support H.R. 313, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. I also want to thank Mr. Farenthold of Texas for his good work in carrying on this matter. This is a very good bill, and appreciate his leadership on this. We recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you very much for making this one of the first bills we're moving through the committee. It's an important one. It shows our commitment to those people who answered the call to service. Well, we're answering their call to get the medical attention that they were promised without having to sacrifice their pay. I'm happy to support this legislation that will provide disabled veterans who enter the federal workforce the opportunity to seek medical treatment for their service-connected disabilities without being forced to take unpaid sick leave. By allotting 104 hours of sick leave up front to the first year federal employees, it gives them the opportunity to get the treatment that they need. And quite frankly, this is only fair. They've actually been on the government payroll when they were in the service, but when they move from the military to civilian, they step back to the bottom of the line. This at least with respect to sick leave and service-related disabilities moves them back to at least where they were. Quite frankly, it's the least we can do. It's a small but helpful head start to our nation's men and women who've already made significant sacrifices while in the military, who then continue to serve their country within the federal workforce. I'm looking forward to voting in favor of this bill. I'm very happy to have worked with Mr. Lynch on it. Look forward to also joining as a co-sponsor for the additional legislation that will extend this to the entire federal workforce. I urge my colleagues on the committee to vote favorably to move this on to the House floor, and let's get it passed over into the Senate, get it passed there and signed by the President. This is one I think we can all agree on, and I'll yield back the remainder of my time.
Mr. Chairman.
Do any other members wish to speak on the bill? The gentleman from Maryland, the ranking member, Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much. I want to, Mr. Chairman, thank Congressman Lynch and Congressman Farrell for a great bill. This is something that is so much needed. So often, when I see the veterans in my community, a lot of them feel that they go off and to war. They serve their country and they're forgotten. And trying to address the day-to-day problems that they have, medical problems, this will go a long way in helping them. But not only will it help them, it'll help their families. I mean, because it gives them an opportunity to take care of their needs and their problems. And Mr. Chairman, I hope that you will join me when we get this bill out of here to get it to the floor as fast as possible and urge our fellow comrades on the Senate side to get it done. I think the more we can do for our veterans, the better. I'm always amazed at the State of the Union where everybody stands up every time we talk about our military, but a lot of times our military has not gotten their due. And so with that, I yield back. And again, I want to thank the gentleman for this very important piece of legislation.
The gentlewoman from the District of Columbia.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to strongly support this bill. I think it's the least we can do to the 1%, and that's what they are. Less than 1% are carrying the load for all of the rest of us. And remember when the average federal employee comes onto the rolls, that person is presumed to be healthy. We know that this veteran is not healthy in that sense. He might be healthy enough to work, but we know he has medical problems. It's the least we can do for these veterans. And Mr. Chairman, in the same spirit, I'm not sure what the cost of this bill is. I'm sure whatever it is, it's worth it. It's just a year's leave. But in the same spirit, Ms. Maloney and I and several other members introduced a no-cost bill yesterday that would allow the same federal employees, and by the way, some of those coming back are women, to have parental leave when a child, paid parental leave when a child is born. The reasons it's no cost is because the agencies would make due for, I think it's 6 weeks, that the parent was gone. This, just as the ranking member says we give lip service to veterans because we can't help ourselves, we owe them so much. We do the same thing to our families, and yet the way in which a parent has to, certainly a woman, has to think about spending any time with her infant is she better come to work sick while she's pregnant, because she will have to cobble whatever sick leave she may have and perhaps some annual leave to get any time, if she's a federal employee, to be with that newborn infant. We now know that those years, 0 to 5, are the critical years for brain development. Because this bill costs nothing, we can't imagine that would not be one of the bills that at some point this committee might want to consider. With that, I fully support this bill, which it seems to me on its face deserves our support. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Did you want to have her yield to?
Pardon me?
Did you want her to yield?
Yes.
Okay.
I also want to congratulate my colleagues on this very important bill. We don't do enough to recognize our veterans that risk their lives for us and often struggle to recover. I also wanted to underscore this bill that doesn't cost anything, that allows us to catch up to the private sector. 75% of the Fortune 100 companies have paid leave. We have Google gives 20 weeks, Hewlett-Packard 20 weeks, Bank of America 12 weeks. We have only unpaid leave in the Congress of the United States, and for federal workers, 85% of the federal workers are not in this area. They're around the country in different areas, and I find it an embarrassing, almost a national disgrace that New York, or rather America, ranks last in the community of nations in providing support for maternity leave for fathers and mothers. A study this year at the United Nations reviewed 185 countries. 183 of them provide paid leave. At the bottom of the list is America with Papua New Guinea. America's not used to being at the bottom of the list, and CEOs can't be wrong on what they know are good family policies. And at no cost, it's very Republican, no cost, yet you can do many good things. This bill has been reported out of this committee twice and passed the United States Congress twice in the House of Representatives. It did not pass in the Senate, and it passed with a strong bipartisan support. So I did want to raise that to the attention of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle. And I hope that on this committee we can find things like we are today to work together that makes work-family balance better, our country safer, makes government more efficient and work more efficiently. And from a business point of view, there's many studies that says paid leave and being able to come back to your job saves businesses money. They don't have to recruit, train, and makes them perform more efficiently for business. So I just wanted to underscore that. I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentlewoman yields back. I'm going to strike the last word to simply say how much I appreciate Mr. Lynch and Mr. Farenthold, others on this committee working together in a good bipartisan way. This is an exceptionally good bill. It does the right thing for people who have given their all, the sacrifice for this country. We honor them. We thank them. This is one of the at least we can do to make their life and their work life better. I really do appreciate this bill. I'm proud to bring it up as one of the first bills coming out of this committee on the first day. And with that, I'll yield back. Do any other members wish to be heard? Are there? Ms. Lawrence. Yes, Ms. Lawrence, Michigan, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, I've worked in human resources for decades with the United States Postal Service. So I fully support H.R. 313, the Wounded Warriors Federal Leave Act of 2015. As of 2013, over 9% of the United States adult population was a veteran. We were always aware of this large number of veterans within our ranks at the Postal Service. Veterans historically have had a friend in the Postal Service. They are the largest civilian employer of veterans. As of employing almost 490,000 career employees, and about 130 of those employees were former service members of the military. Since our wars that we've seen in Afghanistan and Iraq, we have had so many of our men and women returning with injuries, both seen and unseen. Many of these wounded warriors are seeking to create a new life of service with the federal government. To support this bill is to support the many wounded warriors that are still under medical care by the Veterans Administrations and our TRICARE affiliates. They need this sick leave right away, and they have earned it. There is no greater sacrifice for one's country than that to risk life or limb for it. They have done this, and let us do this small thing for them. And I 100% support this, and I yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank the gentlewoman. Does anybody else wish to be heard on this?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley is recognized.
I thank the chair, and just briefly, I commend our colleague Stephen Lynch for his leadership on this. It's a practical thing that will make a huge qualitative difference in the lives of so many of our wounded warriors coming back from the front. So I thank him for his leadership, and I associate myself with the remarks of Ms. Lawrence, and I urge passage of the bill. And I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Does any other member wish to be heard on this bill? The question is now on the adoption and are there any amendments to the amendment? Pardon me. To the bill? The question is now on the adoption and favorable reporting of H.R. 313 to the House of Representatives. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. We have some unfinished business regarding H.R. 50. The question is now on the adoption and favorably reporting H.R. 50 to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chaffetz.
Aye.
Mr. Chaffetz votes aye. Mr. Micah.
Aye.
Mr. Micah votes aye. Mr. Turner. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Wahlberg. Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Amash. Mr. Amash votes aye. Mr. Gosar. Mr. Gosar votes aye. Mr. Desjardins. Mr. Desjardins votes aye. Mr. Gowdy. Mr. Gowdy votes aye. Mr. Farenthold. Mr. Farenthold votes aye. Mrs. Lummis. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Meadows. Mr. Meadows votes aye. Mr. DeSantis. Mr. DeSantis votes aye. Mr. Mulvaney. Mr. Mulvaney votes aye. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Walker. Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Blum. Mr. Blum votes aye. Mr. Heiss. Mr. Heiss votes aye. Mr. Russell. Mr. Carter. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman votes aye. Mr. Hurd. Mr. Hurd votes aye. Mr. Palmer. Mr. Palmer votes aye. Mr. Cummings. Mr. Cummings votes no. Mrs. Maloney. Mrs. Maloney votes no. Ms. Norton. Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Clay. Mr. Clay votes no. Mr. Lynch. Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper. Mr. Connolly.
No.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Cartwright.
No.
Mr. Cartwright votes no. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Kelly.
No.
Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Lawrence.
No.
Ms. Lawrence votes no. Mr. Liu. Mrs. Watson-Coleman.
No.
Mrs. Watson-Coleman votes no. Ms. Plaskett. Ms. Plaskett votes no. Mr. Desaulniers. Mr. Desaulniers votes no. Mr. Boyle. Mr. Boyle votes no.
Are there any other members who wish to be recorded? Clerk will report the tally.
That's what I got. On this vote, we have 20 ayes and 13 noes.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, pursuant to Clause 2L of the House Rule 11, members will have 2 days to submit views on H.R. 50 and H.R. 313. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bills reported today, subject to the approval of the minority. Hearing no objection, so ordered. If there's no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it.